Hello and welcome to Phase 1, Module 1. My name is Jared Nichols. I am the creator of this course. I'm also your instructor, and this course is titled Introduction to Strategic Foresight. So often when I'm working with a group or speaking in front of a group for the first time, one of the first questions I ask is how many people are familiar with the concept of strategic foresight or are familiar with the ways in which strategic foresight has been used. And very few people tend to raise their hand, and I tend not to be surprised by that. Strategic foresight has traditionally been a fairly obscure field. Most that are familiar with strategic foresight or have been trained in the practice of foresight tend to work usually tucked away somewhere in a think tank. But strategic foresight is simply the practice of looking at how the future might unfold as opposed to how the future will unfold. And it's the idea that we don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but that's not an obstacle to overcome. That's actually an advantage that we have. It's just knowing how to better take that information or to think differently about the future so that we can position ourselves for multiple future possible outcomes. Now, we refer to these multiple possible future outcomes as alternative futures. And alternative futures are a collection of various possible future scenarios based on the plausible implications of trends and issues that we see in the present day. Strategic foresight began in the U.S. military following the Second World War, and this was in response to the growing complexity of geopolitics that emerged, especially in the face of access to weapons of mass destruction, such as the atomic bomb, coupled with a rapid rise in warfare technology. This brought about a new field of inquiry, or a new way of looking at the future, which was strategic foresight. And it also led to the formation of think tanks and corporations such as the RAND Corporation, which is one of the earliest and most well-known think tank in our country. And think tanks were really designed to look for wild cards or the unexpected events that most people are not even thinking about. They would also entertain absurd ideas that were out on the fringes that most people would think were just mere science fiction. And they would do this in order to create alternative scenarios for the military to plan by so that they were ready for multiple possible outcomes and situations. Now, of course, thinking on the fringes or entertaining absurd ideas about the future definitely comes with its social consequences. You may be familiar with the Columbia Pictures 1964 film Dr. Strangelove. Well, the character Dr. Strangelove was actually a parody of Thomas Kuhn of the RAND Corporation. So where do we see foresight being utilized in the present day? Some of the places that we see foresight as an active part of the culture would be in the military and defense industry. Examples would be TRADOC, DARPA, JSOC. These organizations utilize foresight for the purposes of exploring the future of warfare, exploring technology's role on the battlefield, and also looking at emerging threats and the changing face of enemy combatants. We also see foresight being used in the intelligence community. Organizations such as the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, they tend to utilize foresight in a different way. But the way in which they utilize foresight is for things such as big data analysis or trying to identify patterns that otherwise wouldn't be recognized by most people. And they also utilize foresight to analyze human behavior or changes in human behavior and cultures, looking at the way that public perception may be shifting, all for the sake of trying to identify where potential threats to national security may emerge. Strategic foresight is also used in the business community as well. Foresight is used by some of the most powerful and successful corporations in the world. Some of those corporations are Royal Dutch Shell, Apple, Walmart, Nike, and Ford. And these corporations either have their own think tank or they have an onboard futurist, someone who is specifically designed to look at how the future may unfold over the next 10, 25, 50 years and beyond. Now, the business community utilizes foresight in a different way. They may utilize foresight for new product development, or they may be looking at a new type of service design to meet the changing demographics of their customer base. Or they may be leveraging their current position in the market to break into new markets or to create new market space altogether. A question that I'm often asked is, how does strategic foresight differ from strategic planning or the traditional approaches to strategic planning? And one of the ways in which I like to explain this is that the main difference is around the concept of perceptual location. And perceptual location is important because it's based on where we are thinking. What place are we standing in to make our decisions? So if we do a quick comparison of traditional strategic planning models and the practice and utilization of foresight, the differences that we see is that strategic planning stands in the present, looks to the past in order to plan for the future, whereas strategic foresight stands in the future, looks back to the present, and tries to identify how we made it to our ultimate ideal future outcome. So you may be wondering, how do we stand in the future and look backward? Well, the good news is that this entire program is designed to teach you how to do that and do it effectively. But the first part of that is changing the way in which we think about the future. So again, thinking back to the first part of this module, the strategic foresight teaches us to look at the future as a series of alternative futures, equipping us to envision our organization's future relevance, how we meet customer need and demand, and also being able to identify new opportunities in emerging business landscapes. As we continue on in this program, there are three requirements, if you will, for success in this program and, of course, upon completion and when you apply this to your organization. And the first of those is that you're willing to challenge traditional ideas about the future. And the second is that you're able to challenge your own bias and assumptions about the future. And the third is that you are willing to challenge the traditional models of decision making. Here's why this is important. If you look at the way that we as human beings are naturally programmed, we are reactive by design. The concept of foresight is not instinctual in us. We are much more of a fight or flight creature. And unfortunately, that means that we are habitually slow learners. We tend not to learn from mistakes as quickly as we need to. The practice of strategic foresight then, of course, goes against most of our natural inclinations. But the advantages, of course, is that it allows us to avoid potential calamity. It also allows us to identify and seize new opportunities. And it equips us to adapt to sudden changes or unexpected events that may take place. Now, the purpose of strategic foresight is to make better decisions about the future in the present day. So I want to briefly talk about the way that we make decisions historically and the way that we continue to make decisions today. And it's based on three elements. And the first is our access to information. The second is the interpretation of that information. And then the third is the integration of that information into our cultural narrative. So here's where we are running into some issues in the present day, in the information age. If we look at the output of decision making from the past and compare that with the present, the key features are this. In the past, we had limited or delayed access to information, which would also mean that we had a more narrow interpretation of that information. But that would also mean that we had an easier integration of that information into the cultural narrative. There was much more of the population that could agree on whether something was good, bad, whether this country or these people were enemies or allies, and so on. We adopted ideals and beliefs about who we were as people and as a culture much more readily. Now, in the present day, in the information age, we have unprecedented and immediate access to information, which then turns into multiple interpretations, or more like pontifications, of that information. And then that in turn creates a disjointed integration into a cultural narrative that continuously changes while new information is being introduced. So the objective here in strategic foresight is to leverage the unprecedented access that we have to information to be able to better interpret that information within the context of the present day and looking at the implications for the future. And then to be able to turn this into a powerful story or a narrative that moves people to action. The first part of that is knowing how to leverage our unprecedented access to information. And I like to look at information as in three different stages. In stage one is the weak signal stage. It's something that is out on the horizon. It's just information. It's data. And it may be significant to a very small segment of the population, but for the rest of the population, it goes completely unnoticed. Now, stage two is when it moves into the potential stage, the potential event stage. You're looking at this information is now gaining momentum, and there is some potential that this could have an impact. We're just not sure where. And then stage three is where it becomes an actual event. It's here, it's arrived. And it's at this stage where information has now evolved into news. Once information has reached stage 3 and evolved into news, you have one option, and that is to react to that news. So strategic foresight equips us to plan in the weak signal stage, to identify those things that are off on the horizon, and to be able to keep a watchful eye of what that might potentially become. So we can watch it from stage 1, and by the time it hits stage 3, we have already taken the necessary action to position ourselves for success or to avoid calamity or to identify new opportunities.